Hello everyone, how are we this evening? Thank you all to those coming tonight and those of you online for our Connecting Agricultural Data Across Scales to Maintain Food Supply talk. Without further ado though, we will introduce Dr. Scott Chapman, and I've been told he's flown back up from Sydney only today, so very much would like to thank him for being here. Scott graduated in the early 1990s from UQ, and after a few years abroad came back and spent more than just over around 24 years with CSIRO across a range of projects. Since 2020, Scott has been back at UQ in the agriculture space, working across a range of AI and machine learning projects. And really his role today, or as he's told me, is to help bring together people from the IT sector, maths, physics, engineers and others to help to develop new projects and opportunities at the intersection of technology and agriculture. Won't spoil any more from there. Scott, thank you.
So this is actually modified from a talk I've given around data science and agriculture. I've spent the last few years doing this kind of stuff. I'm a crop physiologist, which means I care about how plants work. And I guess early in the piece, I finished my PhD, and then I ended up in a job building a sunflower computer model back in the early 90s. And crop modelling developed in the 60s. I was born, but I guess during the 90s, systems modelling was becoming a big topic, and there was a big investment back then. I'll talk a little bit about some of that. But I was one of the first people to do that type of work in Queensland, or at least in that group. There was a big group set up called the APSIM Initiative, which is a joint venture essentially between CSIRO, the state government, University of Queensland, and since then there have been some other partners. And it's one of the biggest systems modelling initiatives in the world, because decision support modelling for us is a very powerful tool because we're in such a risky environment. So being able to make better decisions about risk is important. And I guess the other thing that started to motivate things, and I was talking to John about it, he asked me how I ended up in this stuff, and one of the ways it happened was that back in about 2007, CSIRO was building drones. Well, they weren't. They were buying those training helicopters. So you might have I don't know whether anyone's ever seen a single rotor motor trainer. It's about this big. Literally has a wingspan about the same as my arms, except it can spin at 12,000 revs per minute, which I can't do and I won't demonstrate. But they're incredibly dangerous looking machine, especially when it's being flown by a computer that was built by CSIRO. My great colleagues at CSIRO who designed it, and it was, some of the first in the world that you could use. Yeah, anyway, you couldn't buy a drone off the shelf like you can now. And so we started using those in 2008. And that's how I got into that aerial surveying type work. And I guess since then, we've started to try to replace some of the technologies we're using with drones. We're trying to use satellites to do some of the things we used to do with drones, because satellites get better and better and better. So I'll talk a bit about how some of that work's progressed. So, is that working now? Right. I'm just going to go page down or click something. Do I have to touch the screen? Or is it advanced? Shouldn't I be able to just do that?
You should.
I think I'll be short talking it.
Yeah.
I'm happy to wing it. So, yeah, I'll just use the pointer. It's okay. So, I did want to, I'll put these up at the end as well. Some of the fun things you get to do working at a university in 2019, I think this was, I can't remember now, 2021, it might have been actually, 2021. The Brisbane Street Art Festival and UQ got together to do some things. And I had this street artist, Madeline Holt, who lives out at Fig Tree Pocket. And that drawing, which is on Gregory Terrace, just near the traffic lights at the top of the back of the Echo there, you can see that mural that she put there. There's a whole lot of other murals there. And that's supposedly what my data looks like. So that probably gives you some indication of what to expect for the rest of the talk. So if you think some of my data is indecipherable, then you'll understand why Madeline drew it quite like that. This is a terribly messy graph. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to go in massive detail. But you know, we are almost compelled to talk about this every time we do this type of talk in agriculture, that both global food demand is increasing and global food supply is being affected. So these colours are, and you can have a look at this paper if you want to read a bit more about it, but it was published in Nature Food. And what this is looking at food demand per capita or in total calories for the entire world under some different scenarios. So there's a green one, which is a sustainable scenario. There's a fossil fuel development one. And these are being forecast using the global climate model forecast out into the future, out into sort of 2050, 2070. And this is a population at risk of hunger under some of this work. And what it shows is that we can keep using fossil fuels and we'll keep the population at risk of hunger down, but we can also get down to those levels with a sustainable structure. So there's a lot of economic and societal assumptions in here. The worst one is to have regional rivalry, and we certainly have that at the moment. The Ukraine produce a huge amount of the world's wheat. I think it's around 15 to 20%, and that having that grain supply cut off at the moment is a terrible impact on the rest of production. And we're around about 6 weeks grain supply at the moment without that for the whole world. That's how much we have. And that's with Russia still selling their grain to their customers. So, you know, it's not just climate change that we're worrying about. We're imperiled by these economic and political disagreements or decision making, and some of those will exacerbate some of the figures that are here around the way that population's driving food demand and the impact of climate change on top of that, and the potential risk of hunger as a result. The types of technologies that we work on building computer models have been used by a lot of people around the world. This is a nice piece of work from a group from the US and Europe. We know them quite well, so I think there were some CSIRO people involved in this one as well. And the interesting thing is that when you look at things like this is maize and this is wheat, and these are potential annual production under different scenarios. So that yellow one there is a rather nasty warming scenario, which is actually, unfortunately, the trajectory we're mostly on. And you can see for crops like maize, the future out to that's sort of 2050, 2060, beyond about 2050, the productivity starts going down for that crop. And maize is a summer crop. It needs rain. It's grown in a hot part of the year, and so without a lot of genetic adaptation, which we may or may not be able to exploit, it's hard to maintain that productivity. If you look at a crop like wheat, though, the current wheat production areas tend to push up. So we might have a bit more wheat production, a bit less maize, which is probably a good thing because there's a lot more people who want to eat wheat than in the past. And some of our biggest customers for Australian farmers, like Indonesia, we had a group of millers and providers in that sector visiting UQ last week, and on a tour that one of our lecturers is teaching about agribusiness and milling and so on. And there's a big shift in Indonesia towards wanting to have high quality bread wheat. So in the past, they were being able to buy all that West Australian wheat, the low quality soft wheats for noodles, but now there's a bigger move in the population to want bread wheat. which is great for Queensland, except that because we produce high quality bread wheat, but there's a challenge there because most of that we feed to cattle. so if they want it, they're going to have to pay for it, and they're going to have to fight with our feedlots because we have most of the feedlots in the country that are right here in Queensland. So there's a lot of domestic dynamics in our food supply and how much we can sell and what we do. And we do get the impression sometimes that we're the food bowl of the world sort of thing. We're not. We only produce a tiny, tiny amount. We do export a lot of what we produce, but it's only sort of 5 to 10%, not even 10% of the world's needs. It's more like 5. So we are critical in the international markets, Australian providing those, and Australian farmers are very important in that system, but we're by no means the food bowl that sometimes we get the impression from public press. But it is important for our own economy to maintain it, of course. So UQ's work, and we're doing a lot more work in trying to build better bioeconomies and looking at how do we, there's a lot more. I'm giving you some impression of the types of research we're interested in. We're interested in trying to complete the circle of efficiently producing food and using energy efficiently. One of the things that I'd like to see happen, which I won't talk about tonight, is what if all of the grain trucks in some of our regions were electric? Essentially, you've got silos that are taking in all of the grain. There's an opportunity there to put a massive great amount of solar panels or something next to those charged trucks, and they're only doing 300 kilometers a day, so you could easily power them. There's a lot of things being thought about in that space, and UQ is also establishing a zero net energy CRC to look at some of those questions, particularly for agriculture, and particularly, of course, to deal with cattle emissions, which everybody's heard about the challenge of that, and how to manage that through genetics and diet and different ways of approaching it. The last few years, there's been a huge interest in farm tech. This is a nice website, Better Food Ventures. They update this every year, and I should have updated this one. But there's been immense interest in food tech and technologies applied to agriculture. I'll talk to some of that stuff tonight. But the reality is, you can make a lot of money if you create an app that you sell to the public and everybody puts on their phone, right? Like, even if you get 50 cents each and you've got a few 100 million people, that's terrific. But we've only got about 40,000 farmers, so they can only spend so much money, and they don't want another app. You can find that out from a survey pretty quickly. And so I think what needs to happen with a lot of these models is, how do our traditional suppliers, like fertilizer suppliers, how do they then encourage farmers to use stuff more efficiently? And I think one of the ways is that it's put into the price of fertilizer. Maybe there's a little subscription. So business to business farm tech, I think, is a really good solution, where those businesses might be trying to work out, if we can forecast the yield accurately, we'll know where we need all the fertilizer, and we won't send too many tons of fertilizer to Emerald. We'll send it to Governor Whitby or wherever else it might need to be. I did want to talk about some applications of AI in our kind of work, and these are some diverse examples. One of them, a big one, is in traceability of provenance. So there's a lot of research in this space now. Having systems where video is being used in an abattoir, not just open on the internet, I might add, but it's used to, for every cut that might be made, they can take an image of that and then embed digital signatures in that, so that when someone unpacks it in the country that's been sent to, they can verify that's actually the right piece. It's all done digitally. You don't have to actually compare the photos yourself, but you can validate things, because this stops things like substitution. The substitution of food has been happening, and trying to protect Australian income involves trying to do this kind of work. And so the UQ Cyber Group are involved in projects in that space. Another fun project that I was involved in the last couple of years with Guido was this project called Ag Ask, which when we first started this 2019, it was before ChatGPT, but now ChatGPT essentially does this. But this is an example of we taking all of the ag extension data that we could get our hands on for from GRDC, Grains Research Development Corporation, who funded that research, and building these automated systems. So it's a chat GPT for farmers to answer questions, and it's been orientated for that. And this came from Guido and a team at CSIRO who've been developing those technologies to help doctors find information quickly, and other types of applications. So and the last AI example I want to talk about before I went into my stuff was one that came out yesterday from a team at UQ. It's a nice little article. It's only 2 pages long, but it's around how we use artificial intelligence to accelerate plant breeding and animal breeding to develop adaptation to challenges in agriculture. So I had the example here of phenotyping for target traits like heat tolerance, yield, managing pests and disease resistance. And the advantage is that a lot of our genetics models have been built in a fairly linear fashion, and it's hard to put all the information in there that someone might want. But what you can start to do now with machine learning approaches, you can gather information through surveys, through surveys that people answer, or you can gather information from consumers, you can gather information from all levels, and that can be built into the way that we develop and select new varieties of tomatoes or new ways of producing animals for adaptation to different climates. So the rest of this talk, I want to talk about researching at different scales. So a lot of our historical research is around experimentation. I'll show you another picture of this in a minute. These are different scales of measurement that we do. And an example of this might be selecting varieties of wheat or sorghum or cereals like that with tolerance to high temperatures. So you design experiments, you have facilities to confirm genetic basis for that, and then you design protocols to select for it in breeding, for example. And at the other end of the scale, we're thinking about things like forecasting. So this is for Moree Shire here, and Moree Shire produces about 1 million tonnes of wheat in a good year. Not much, a bad year. We don't know what's going to happen this year. El Nino is supposedly here, but it sure is hot enough. I went swimming in Sydney yesterday, so it must have been pretty hot. No, it was still 18 degrees. It was cold for Queensland. But we're starting to build, with the new satellite technologies and actually the kinds of satellite technologies that John works with, I've just discovered tonight. We're starting to use those technologies to estimate crop production at fine scales. We can estimate within fields, essentially, what the production is, and we can do that at scale, and we can start to forecast that. And that has a whole lot of implications for markets and logistics, and we're still working through a lot of all of those. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So UQ, we're spending a fair bit of effort to rejig our facilities. I think it did make the popular news that our glass houses got washed away again in 2021 after being washed away in 2011. So at St. Lucia, that is. And we were already committing towards building this new plant growth facility. So this is a big 3-story building just next to International House at St. Lucia, next to our building, the Hartley Teagle building. And this has got a whole lot of controlled environment rooms inside it where there's small rooms, or about the size of your kitchen, or the office, or a bit bigger, maybe 2 offices. Some of them are much bigger than that, more the size of the map room. And we can run experiments in there with very fine control. So that lets us get at how do plants work. And then we can take them into glass houses and do bigger experiments, and we can take them into this facility we call DigiField, which is actually a nursery with an opening roof on it. It's about 3,000 square meters. It's being built. I could give you a live picture of it. It's dark, so I won't. But it's being constructed right now. And the idea of that is that even though it's a nursery, you'll see several of them around the Lockyer Valley, these types of nurseries where they're used for producing vegetables mostly, but we're using it to control drought and heat. So we can close the roof during summer for 4 hours or something, and we basically make it really hot, cook the plants, get some reaction out of them, understand whether what we've done in this fancy plant growth facility works in the field. And we can also exclude the rainfall so that we can do drought experiments in years where it won't stop raining, which can be frustrating. We also do a lot of work with field phenotyping. This is a tractor from, this is actually a Syngenta tractor in Europe. But this tractor here, I'll show you some more in a minute, has a whole heap of sensors in it that basically can measure at a resolution of about 1 centimetre everything. So if I drove it across to you guys, I would have a perfect 3D picture of everybody with all of the colours and the positions of everything. It's got a LiDAR built into it, and we start to understand the structures of the crops and the biochemistry of the crops and how they can react to different situations. So you sort of go to, you have a change in scale. We can do much bigger experiments in these facilities, and that one's at Gatton, but less environment control. And we sort of move from understanding the basic physiology and genetics to application in breeding and agronomy. Again, at the other scale, this is some very nice work from Andries Potgieter at UQ. And if you want to look at some of this work, I think it was actually published in 2023. What Andries publishes once a month is the yield forecast for the country for wheat. So he's using satellite data and some very simplified crop models to do that. So if you look at the season, we're predicting the amount of yield that might be occurring, and that should say kilos per hectare, not tons per hectare. And you get to this point of the season, so you might start predicting March, April, May. So we've got global climate models, actually from the European Met Office. They make some of the best in the world. We use those, and so we run with the current weather up to today. We can run it to August. There'll be a new one soon, I think this week or next week. And then we run ensemble forecasts, or we run yield forecasts using the global climate models or the historical records. Excuse me, I'm going to just... So we have this forecast envelope from today where we think the yield's going to be between these two extremes. And as we get further into the season, we can get more and more precise. So you end up with this research cycle where you're using these fancy facilities to understand how plants work. We actually feed a lot of that into computer models. And then those computer models and other models might be used for short-term predictions, but they can also be used for long-term forecasting. So here we've done some work looking at what kinds of droughts and heat environments are going to be 30 or 40 years' time, so that our plant breeders and agronomists can start to think about how to adapt to that. So this is a nice example, which we actually started back in about 2010, but it's now becoming a commercial reality. These are two varieties of sorghum. These are just sorghum heads. They're big. So I don't know how many people know what sorghum is. Does anyone not know what sorghum is? Basically a grain you feed the cattle. That lovely red stuff you see if you go out in the downs in summer. And if you grow it in one of those nice controlled environments that I talked about, you'll see here is a high temperature and a control for a variety that's susceptible. So that's got no grain on it. So it's been exposed to 3 or 4 hours of high temperature in the middle of the day, and it's basically killed all the grain. And that exactly happens. I mean, that happens if you plant something, if you plant sorghum out at Gundawindi in about October, and it's flowering around about mid-January and you get a severe heat event above about 37, 39 degrees, you can have a lot of sterility happen in that crop. But the nice thing is, if you look to the side here, those two on the right are the same as that guy there on the left. That's that same variety with no seeds on it. And this is another variety with heaps of seeds on it. So there's genetic variability for how much heat they can tolerate, which means that we can use that to select for better stuff. And so that's currently a commercial project with breeding company who are using that to now adapt to breed new sorghums that can handle that heat. It's a nice, convenient kind of example to explain, I suppose. So I just realised I've got a lot more slides left. I'm going to skip through a little. A lot of the work that we're trying to do now is, as John said in the introduction, is how do we get our computer scientists and maths people much more involved and interested in agriculture? Now, one thing I can do is use dollars because we have lots of funding in agriculture to do cool research. And so we're starting to invest in areas to try to bring those people in. I've often tell students, I teach a third-year course in crop physiology and modelling. I'll be teaching on Friday, if anyone wants to come. But agriculture is a science that just steals from everyone else. So it's a bit like the English of the sciences. We've been doing it for 10,000 years. It's one of the oldest sciences. So I guess you could say botany and zoology, well, at least ecology was probably a little ahead of that when we were hunting and gathering. But as soon as people started to grow food, agriculture as a science became to be invented, and farmers have been breeding for 10,000 years. It's just that we got very good at it in the last 100 because quantitative genetics was discovered and we worked out how to use it. And in the last 20 years, it's become amazingly good because of genomic selection and ways that we can accelerate breeding. But, you know, it's a science that steals from everywhere. And so I guess part of my job my whole life has been to look out at what can I steal next. And I'm quite selfish about how to bring that in. And the last 5 years or so, we've been certainly looking a lot at how we can use machine learning and some of these methodologies in our work. So I'm going to talk about some of that. So how do we combine these technologies across scales? I'm going to show this slide about half a dozen times. But it's these are some of the names that we use for some of these technologies. Phenotyping is what do plants look like. So genotyping is what's their DNA. Phenotyping is what they look like. Any attribute, my height, what clothes I'm wearing, any of that stuff, except that we're trying to do it in terms of their biology. Crop growth modelling is a way of taking all that information that you measure and turning it into something that we can predict with instead of just doing a regression. Remote sensing, I think everybody in this room knows about, and how do we apply a lot of these AI techniques in our work. So
The minor project came about.
whoa, no. Sorry about that. I just realised I had a recording of that one. I did have a big project here, which I'm going to have to do this or else it's going to keep playing. Sorry, I forgot to turn off the animation. This project is the National Variety Trials, and you can look at that if you want to see more information about that. But GRDC funds National Variety Trials in Australia, and those are validations of performance of wheat varieties, for example, so that farmers can make decisions about what they're going to use next. Sorry about all the other detail in the slide. I won't go into that too much detail. But we have been doing a lot of what we call high throughput phenotyping. So Australia has a national facility called the Australian Plant Phenomics Facility. UQ is becoming a node of that. The new one, I was actually at that meeting yesterday where that's been set up. But we've already been doing that kind of work at UQ ourselves. And so you can see these kinds of sensors. RGB camera is just a normal camera. Multispectral camera is one that's got different bandwidths in it. LiDAR, I think most people know more or less what LiDAR is. It's a laser rangefinder technology. So most self-driving cars have got LiDARs on. So that same kind of technology that you can build 3D point clouds as you go. And hyperspectral just means, being able to measure it across a lot of spectra up to at least 1,000, sometimes to 2,500 nanometers. So we've got this fancy tractor down at Warwick that we built about 10 years ago now that has all that tech on it. And now we also fly a lot of that tech on drones. And so what it allows us to do is to map all of these plants in very high detail, and we can get the structural information. What does that canopy look like, and how well does that canopy work? So how does it catch light? How does it suck up water? And how does it then consequently turn it into yield?
In the trial environment.
Oh, no. Lilia, I need to turn off the narration's on. I had it turned off, but you have to turn it off on the PowerPoint. No, it's the. Sorry, guys. Let me just do this. Let's try and turn this off. Animation. It's turned. Oh God. It's turned on. I think if I go through the slide and come back, it'll. Sorry. Chat. I think it'll work. Let me just try that. I had a recording of this. I think if I go
In the trial environment.
Just turn the volume down.
No, then no one else can hear it. If I go forward and back, it goes into the. Sorry about that. Oh, that's me waving the pointer around without any hands, right? So people online, sorry, I'm not. Follow the red dot. That's me talking, but you're not hearing it, which is good. But this is an example of a trial that we might run in the field. So this is in a farmer's field, and where you see that box that says MBT, that's a variety trial. So each of those plots is about 7 meters long and 2 meters wide, and it's one variety. There'll be 3 replicates of that in the trial. And sorry, it's a bit disturbing watching that red dot move around, but anyway. We've installed a whole series of sensors into that, including a field camera, so a trail cam to watch wheat grow, basically, a canopy temperature sensor, and then we've been doing measurements in those trials. So over the last 3 years, we kept ourselves occupied in COVID doing this, essentially, or at least paying people to do some of it. So sorry about this, about that animation. And we've also been doing UAV flights on a lot of these. So flying drones and like a lawnmower pattern, it's really boring. Computer does it. And then we stitch all the pictures together and we get a high resolution picture. And we're also getting satellite data together. I'm going to apologize in advance if my voice turns up in the slide. The problem is you have to turn it off in every PowerPoint on every computer. I didn't realize it was on this one. So that's what a trial might look like. We fly the drone over that, and we can build this really high resolution picture, and we can extract information about all those plots. If we're using the tractor, we've got a whole pipeline, a computer pipeline to turn all of that into some knowledge around understanding what that canopy looks like and what the consequences are for yield. And then we get into more fun stuff. I was asking technicians around the country. We've taken over 200,000 photos now of wheat plants. So if anybody wants to go to sleep, seriously, put your sleep this stuff. We've walked around. So we had to speed this up because the technicians were saying, this takes too long. We don't want an app. Because if you give us an app and I have to walk around on this plot, choose that, take a photo. And I said, well, okay, tell you what, walk through the field and hold your phone over the plot, take 3 photos and then take a photo of the sky. And just go down the field and do that. And then when you get to the end of the field, take 2 photos of the sky. And then we just ran that through a quick machine learning algorithm so we could identify all the plots. And it was just a fast way of doing it. But what we were doing with all of those images is then we're counting all the heads. These are ears of wheat. So this is photos of wheat, which are about 1 meter high. And we're counting the number of heads there, and with machine learning techniques I'll talk about in a minute. But we're able to just, so every time you try and implement these technologies, you have to think about the practical application of it and how you're going to collect the data. and how you're going to do it efficiently. So you have to do this with technicians. Otherwise, they're going to say, now that took me an hour to collect that, and I want to do it in 10 minutes or whatever. So crop growth modeling, I won't spend much time on this. Although this was the core stuff, it probably got me into all of this type of analytics. There's quite a nice paper here, which was, I think that was an update paper of the work back in about 2014, but it's a big team of people who build the AppSim cropping systems model, and it's used at all types of levels in decision making, from policy and forecasting, climate impacts, and tracking about 400 variables every day. So it's a computer model of how crops grow. Essentially, we're not doing it in 3Ds. We're not growing them as individual plants and doing all the 3D ray tracing analytics, although we can start to do some of that. But it's mainly used as a way of, one of its major inputs is used as decision support tool. So CSIROs run it for the whole country in different scenarios. We have these big databases built up by these computer models so that farmers can make decisions about, in this place, should I add more nitrogen now, depending on what's the expectation or the likelihood of having a lot of rainfall or not. We use that for climate change research. So one of the things we looked at was for sorghum over the next 50 years, is going to be an increase in the proportion of heat stress, which really means that we need to prepare for that sample. We've done stuff like that at scale in sorghum. Some other work that we did was across the US. So I was in a project with the Department of Energy in the US, and we were trying to look at sorghum as an energy source, a bioenergy fuel source. And so trying to calculate where you would grow it and what the value would be in different types of environments. So those models allow us to do that kind of stuff.
In the trial environment.
Yep, that's me talking. Sorry. I know how to get around it. So to go back to this example of this kind of a site, so what are we doing with that kind of data once we start to collect it? So we're using Sentinel-2 a lot, which is this 10-meter satellite with 10 bands. So that's what that trial might look like from that resolution. And this is what it looks like with a 0.5-meter resolution. So there are satellites available now, well, military ones, I think 10 centimeters, probably less. I think they can read number plates. But 0.3 to 0.5 millimeter are becoming available. So we're starting to see enough detail in our trials to be able to make decisions about scoring and understanding what's going on in those crops. So
Vegetation.
I'm very sorry about that.
So those kind of,
Oh God! Sorry, Lily. I didn't turn the speaker on when I tested this because my speaker was off on my computer. So from Sentinel-2, for example, we can pull out all of these signals for the whole season and fit them for a whole series of indices, and then we can work out how to explain what's happened in those trials, and then we feed that into our statistical analyses of those trials.
so those,
Oh, come on. I would turn this off if I'm going to do it. The other area that we're using this in, and Andres is leading this project, is in crop phenology. So we're now starting to use the seasonal trace for these different fields to work out what crop we're looking at. So on the right-hand side here, you can see wheat, barley, canola, chickpea, lentils. We've now got machine learning models that can take satellite imagery and look at the dynamics through the season, and we can work out what crop it is. So that starts to help in a whole range of ways in terms of forecasting what crop yields are going to be, or the logistics around a lot of that kind of thing. Trying to work out how to deal with this. I can't turn the sound off. I can turn the sound off on the speakers, just on this computer. Let me do that. think that'll work. Can people online still hear me? Can someone turn on a mic and say yes?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So to get into some more of these AI things, I thought I'll give you some idea of how we're trying to use some of these technologies. So here's a whole series of cameras at different locations down the side and dates, and these are just the image returns. So these are just field cameras. So if anybody likes spotting animals and putting cameras in the forest and watching stuff or whatever, there's the same kind of camera. It's a trail cam. But we were taking 4 photos a day and across the country and we're sending them back on 4G. The red dots show you all the places where the Telstra signal wasn't so great because we weren't getting the images coming back. So we've been helping Telstra map their signal strength. There were some locations where we weren't getting them back. We got them back at the end of the season, so they were storing them on the cards. So we did get them. But what we can do with that is if you have that camera position at a particular angle, we can calculate the cover. So we can work out how much light has been intercepted by those canopies. And because it's photosynthesis driving everything, we can calculate what the potential biomass production is. So this is, for example, the dynamics of leaf area index over the season from different times of day. And yeah, excuse the red pointer carrying on, but at least you're not hearing my voice twice. But you can see that with that camera, we can track 2 things that are important. One is how much leaf area there is, how much light they're catching, and what they do with that. And we can also catch the dynamics of the wheat crop later in the season, of when the heads are appearing and how quickly they appear. So we can use that information in calculating what stage the crop's up to and what the impact is of that. So we actually ran a couple of machine learning competitions. We put this on a thing called AI Crowd, and I've got the other one, Kaggle was the other one. And we had 2,000 teams around the world signed up. We put a prize of $15,000, said, someone work out how to count all the wheat heads in these images. And we had 2,000 groups of people competing to do it. And it was probably one of the most successful papers we've done in the last couple of years because heaps of people just enjoyed the challenge of it. So one of the ways to get AI into agriculture is to build these data sets and put them out there and get people to play with them. And so we're in the process of doing a fair bit of that. Whoops, sorry, that was the next slide. So we can use those cameras, and with that algorithm that came from that competition and some modifications of that, we were able to set this up to do this. One of the challenges that we have with counting, and this is where the technologies come in that you hear about all the time, generative AI. If you've heard the stories about YouTube and people putting, my head on someone else's body and making me do stuff, that's generative AI, and it's a technology to iteratively learn to make a robust analysis system, basically. So, for example, these are photos from a trial in Warwick of sorghum heads. So this is the sorghum heads are about a metre high, and you've got photos. That's a photo where we're counting them. So we have to label those manually initially so that we can train the model. So we make a detection model, and then we get some photos from another trial, which happens to be in the US with some collaborators, and we run it, and it doesn't work very well at all. But what we can do, and I won't go into a huge amount of detail how it works, but we can use generative AI to make a copy of the different model so that it's in a new domain. So we can basically train the model to be robust to different conditions. So my colleague in Tokyo, did some nice work with this. He said, well, he had all these photos of orange trees, and so he generated apples and tomatoes on orange trees. And he then used that to train tomato algorithms for bushes, and it worked really well. So what happens is you're presenting different domains or styles. And I have another slide that I didn't use here, but you know, if you see any of those style generators or you play with any of that image analytics technologies that are out there, you can represent images with different styles. So you can make that image look like it was a Van Gogh or it was a Picasso or something like that. It's that same kind of technology, and what it does is it just means that our labeling and our measurement becomes really robust. So when we do that, our model with original images, this is the error, so big is bad. So when we measure it on synthetic images, so we create a model and it's got an error of about 20% because there's only 50 heads in each image. But when we train a model on synthetic images, we get much lower error and we're able to make a much more robust model. And so that model will work with almost any set of photos now. So it's this generative AI helps us do that. And so here's an example with a $200 camera of counting wheat heads as we walk in real time. So this little tiny camera, it's about big, has got a GPU built into it, and we can train it and run it at 4 trillion operations per second. And it can count heads, it can count pretty much anything. You could almost drive a Tesla with that stuff. And it's become very cheap to access. So we're starting to look at what do we do next? Can we put that on a harvester? Can we use that to provide more information, to make better decisions about what happens in the future? Can we calibrate yield monitors? You know, can we start to see the sterility? The thing that I talked about at the start. And I guess at the other end of the scale, with the satellite research, we're able now to identify different crops and identify the yield per hectare. So this is a million tons of wheat growing here. We can calculate production on a 5 kilometre scale. We don't do it at the farm scale because we're mindful of privacy issues and understanding, properties might not want to share that information. But we can start to look at how that might be used to analyse grain supply and forecast the needs for that. And with our climate forecasting, or the access to the climate forecasting from the European models, you can actually start to forecast the climates 12 to 18 months ahead. So even before the crops are planted, we can start to calculate how much might be planted and what the yield of that might look like next year. And it gets into the dynamics of, if you look at Moree Shire, we can work out how much the production is going to be at different months of the year, and what the harvester routine is going to look like, and how you might use that information. So that's about the end of this talk. I've gone a little bit longer than I meant to. Probably put too many extra slides in than I should have. But I guess I've been excited about the fact in the last 5 to 10 years, I've had the opportunity to work actually more at a geographic scale, not just at a crop physiological scale, and working with people to work out how do we take a lot of what we understand at a very fine scale and translate that into applications in forecasting and much bigger applications to support agriculture now and future production. So it's another tool in the box for agriculture, basically. So there are some other talks there that are perhaps a little bit less frustrating than the one I just gave. Sorry about myself interfering with myself. And I got a heap of people to thank through all this work, a lot of students, a lot of collaborators. I like to particularly highlight Andres because he does a lot of the work in the yield forecasting area, and a heap of colleagues around the world who, the last 3 years, I didn't see many of them, but I actually saw a bunch of them in the last month. So that was terrific to catch up with people in Europe and in Japan and China on a trip I was fortunate to do a month ago after not going anywhere for 3 years. So I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. Do we have any from the floor or online? Right up.
I really enjoyed your talk. I'm just trying to get
Sorry.
You cover a very wide range, and I'm trying to get a feel for where you plug into how the information is used. Are you aiming to educate government and broad departmental sort of decision makers about what's happening, or are you trying to feed in at the actual
Most of my work's at the
farmers, or
yeah.
how farmers actually make decisions?
There's-
Where
Yeah, the whole agriculture community covers all of that. I guess my historical work has mostly been with, I guess, the support infrastructure for farmers. So most of what I do and the teams that I've worked in have related mainly to plant breeding companies or to consultancy companies or people who are helping to make those tools that help support the decisions. There's a whole heap of researchers around Australia who are much closer to that, either in private or public, you know, whether it's universities, CSIRO or state departments who are closer to that interface. But my clients are usually the businesses just before the farmers, I suppose, or who are supplying decision making around that. I did want to mention the flavour around policy making and things like that, because parts of what we do are in that. But again, it's not my core work. My core work, I suppose, is to present a lot of this type of research and ensure that it keeps getting funded and that we bring more and more people into it. And so I guess this lecture was probably a little more complicated than I quite meant it to be. Qantas didn't help me today. But I guess what we're trying to do, particularly at UQ, is to try to work out how to prepare students to be familiar with data and analytics and how to use that. You just can't, it doesn't make any sense to do a biology degree anymore without being on top of that. And a lot of it, I mean, a lot of it's a lot easier than it used to be, actually. I mean, I had to learn a lot of programming from scratch, and now you can go off and use ChatGPT and say, here, write a program and do this. It doesn't go, well, all I've got to do then is have an expert check that's right. So, yeah. So, yes, apology if I went a bit too wide on that.
Any other questions from the floor?
I was interested in the cultural change, the taste in the Indonesians moving from the soft wheat for their usual historical noodle diet to a bread. Will everyone be standardised? You know.
Oh, I don't think it's just that. I just think that there's just a bigger call for bread-based diets. It's be a higher occurrence of celiac disease, I suppose, in the world. Wheat's growing grain still. I mean, it has, you know, there's a lot of countries in Africa who've decided that wheat makes a better basis for food than sorghum does. Sorghum meal's not that attractive. It's okay as beer or strong alcohol, but it's not as nice as a gruel. It's not a particularly nice product. So I think wheat-based diets are something that's happened, which is positive for Australian farmers. It's by far our major product. But the challenge for us is that the West has these shallow, relatively poor soils, and because of those soils, the farmers are slightly risk averse in terms of putting nitrogen on. So all nitrogen in the West is essentially nitrogen deficient. Sorry, all wheat in the West is pretty much deficient, which means it's very hard to get the protein up. So when the market starts to shift to wanting more protein, the West, which produces somewhere between 30 and 50% of our wheat, they can't do it. They just don't have a cropping system that can do it unless we somehow massively modify the genetics. It's pretty hard to get enough protein into those wheats. So yeah, there's a lot of the world markets are starting to feed back on how we. I mean, there's enough people in the world who want to buy all of our wheat anyway, but you know, the Canadians are starting to come in and compete with us in Indonesia, for example.
Can you predict crop failures in the world?
There are institutions that do that. We don't do that on a regular or routine basis ourselves, but we look at, you know, forecasts for the future and so on. I don't know how well that's been done at the moment. I mean, certainly for Australia, we look at the consequences of El Nino years and things like that. So we know how much that affects different parts of the country. And it's particularly the northeast that's affected by El Nino. The west, not so much. But there are other dynamics coming in now that we can predict better.
Question with Raffle.
So not for Australia, obviously, but the big rice countries, are they doing similar things to rice?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and in fact, some of the wheat research that we're doing on the forecasting, we're doing with China. We collaboration with a group there. Rice has some huge issues with high temperature, and the Yangtze Valley can have massive failures of sterility with rice, and it's a real concern. They have some very bad outcomes sometimes. And the problem there is slightly different because it's actually a flow rate problem. Because it's hugely humid. I was in China a month ago, and it's pretty awful time of year to be in China. So in the south, it's so humid and hot. It's worse than Brisbane. And what happens is it's the same as what happens to us when we get hot and you can't sweat, right? So the plants can't transpire. So the rice crops in the Yangtze Valley in a bad year will get heat events, and they'll essentially end up with calcium deficiencies or sterilities because they can't transpire because the atmosphere is wet, so they can't evaporate water, which means you can't get nutrient flow, and they'll end up with huge sterility dramas. So yeah, there's a lot of research in rice in those topics. But we don't do so much here, although Jackie Mitchell in my school, she's a researcher in that topic, and she works in Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia on rice and adaptation, including high temperature.
Got left field question. One of the quiet concerns we have as Australia's almost totally dependent on fossil fuels for its industry. We import a lot of our phosphate. Even though we've got a lot of phosphate mines, it can become an issue. Nitrogen, I think there's a urea plant being started up. We tend to import too much of that. So whilst we export a lot, we import in our chemicals, we import a lot. Looking at the names there, are we also susceptible to importing too much of our expertise? And we imported a lot of our agricultural expertise 50, 60, 70 years ago. Are we in danger of doing it again?
Of what? Having to import our expertise, or well, we have a fantastic
and
variety.
Probably a moral question there. I think the comment made years ago, there's more Sudanese doctors in London than there are in Sudan.
Yeah,
Stealing other countries' expertise.
yeah. I think you could make part of that case in agriculture. We have a huge need for that. I mean, part of the answer to that comes to automation and robotics, which is not my topic here, but it's been shown very well that there's a lot of opportunity for robotics and automation in agriculture, particularly in horticulture in California. There's been some fantastic stuff in horticulture. And so I think from the labour force point of view, automation and robotics are going to have a big role in agriculture. It has to be, just because of labour shortage. In the expertise area, certainly is the case that a lot of our appointments in science overseas, and we have fast tracks to try to bring people here. So we have a continual need for that. Whether we're training countries of their own expertise, I'm not so sure. I think in agriculture is a little less critical than for Sudanese doctors, for example, you're saying. But I'm only just a baby boomer, and I guess I was in the last year or something, but it's certainly the case that we've had a huge retirement, and it's been ongoing, and a lot of my peers have retired, and the ranks are not as full.
Which
behind
reflects
us.
on our culture. We don't value agriculture enough. Other countries do. If we're not replacing our own.
Yeah, well, there's every ag graduate in Australia. I mean, they should want to do it because there's 10 jobs for every graduate. I think that was on about my third or fourth slide. I mean, it's amazing. There's a heap of jobs there. I work a lot with people in the US, and the Midwest universities, they're very embedded. So there's a huge cultural influence on that being a respected and valued career. Agriculture gives you a fantastic background. I have my colleagues who graduated with me are in every form of industry you can imagine. Bankers, and one of my best friends is back then, she now runs a coffee plantation in Belize, and she was selling sugarcane on the stock market 20 years ago, and now she's doing that. It gives you an extraordinary background to do anything, agriculture, and I've had a great career, an international career, being able to do it. So I would love to tell everybody it's an awesome degree to have and background to have, because we're trained to do anything pretty much. It's a very broad career. Sorry, rambling answer, but
Do you have any questions online?
While I'm online, can I ask a question? I notice you use the word climate, and I'm not sure if you really mean climate or weather patterns, but in the way that you can predict the future, supposedly that climate change is real, you should be able to, in time, maybe 50 years, to determine whether the concept of climate change caused by man or human beings is real or a political aspect. And that brings to mind then, I guess, about the strategic and military use of the kind of ways you can use satellite in order to predict yields of crops, and therefore use that for strategic advantages.
yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. Yeah, I'm not sure. You go back and check whether I misused them. I guess when I say climate and I'm talking about predicting climate for the next year, I'm talking about the fact that it's a spectrum of potential weather outcomes. So I guess in our terminology, we do tend to say it's that, but you can argue the point. I guess as soon as it gets beyond a couple of weeks, it's no longer weather prediction. It's more which one of the historical climates is it going to be, or is it because these are all coming from GCMs, which global climate models, not GWMs, I guess. But I think yeah. Wow. I mean, the only whether or not it's man-made in my lifetime, the wheat belt's gone up 1.5 degrees Celsius, and I had a shirt on yesterday, which I should have been wearing today, which is a really great midnight oil shirt. It's a temperature regime on it, and that's indisputable. So, you know, one of the consequences of that is that if you grew a variety of wheat from the 1960s today, it would be adapted to a cooler climate. So when you grew it in our warmer climate, it would flower later. And so it would flower in later in spring, which means it would get absolutely smashed by high temperature. So you can't use a 50-year-old wheat variety because it won't work in our environment. So the climate's changed underneath us, and our breeding programs have changed the germplasm over time, and that's being built in automatically, which is a good thing. And to some extent, the increase in CO2, which went up from 330 ppm to, was it 410 now? It's over 400. Well, that gives wheat a bit of a free ride too, because wheat is a C3 plant, so it uses this carbon dioxide more efficiently and produces more. On any day, it'll produce more carbon than it used to. But there's a consequence for that. Is if you grow faster with more carbon, which it does, more carbon dioxide, it uses more water. So the consequence of that is that you use water up faster, and when you're growing on stored water, like most of our wheat crop is, you'll crash and burn. So you've got to increase the efficiency of the crop, or you've got to slow down its use somehow, because the plants will grow too fast and they'll run themselves into trouble. So, those are a lot of the types of challenges we're dealing with.
Well,
Whether or not it's
photosynthesis
man-made,
still occurs in marine environments. There's still water. We had the bushfires in Australia, and apparently there were plenty of algae growth in the seawater heading towards Hawaii. So, and there's trees and all the other vegetation other than crops that use CO2. And at the same time, one of the predictions of presumably all the data of the very short time that we had, 60, 70 years, only gives us a little smidgen of information about the cyclical events
sure.
of temperatures, CO2 levels, movement of the Earth, so,
Yes.
and also the movement of the Earth around the sun in terms of cycles. So if we can use the various cycles, like put it crudely, biorhythms of humans, for example, and also you probably already know more about it in crops. And then using those cycles, that's where your metadata and your large data work can really.
Yeah, and I think if the question is around whether we can adapt to all these futures, the answer is no.
If you're saving and looking at green plasm
so far. So no, well, what happens is you potentially can have a geographic shift in where you can produce certain crops. So some crops will have to move away from the equator, essentially, and so there's an argument that Russia's wheat production will go up in the longer term with climate change, and it potentially does, because it opens up more land that's pasture. So yeah, there's a lot of there is a lot of ability to adapt, but one thing we can do is we can test all of our current crops in these controlled environments. We can see what the limits are, and unless we can find some new genetics for some of these crops, we know you can't push a lot of these crops past 40 degrees or something. There's no obvious adaptation in our food crops per se, and it's fine. We could try and see if we could make bread out of cacti, but I mean, the reason why cacti are so well adapted to deserts is they basically grow really slowly, and they save lots of water, so you can't use them economically from that, except to produce tequila.
By the way, do you know they use prickly pear in Sicily as a plantation crop?
Oh, I used to live in Mexico. I used to eat prickly pear salad. It's very nice.
I think we might have to call it there based on the time. Thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you again, Scott, for a fantastic discussion.
Thanks very much.